The debate is no longer whether government should intervene, but how and with which tools.
The market volatility problem is something that policymakers understand at a pretty high abstract level.
And the sort of peak to trough drawdowns of these metals are worse than crypto tokens in many cases.
How should policymakers think about which commodities belong in the Strategic Resiliency Reserve over time? Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. It is Thursday, February 12th. Over the past several weeks in Washington, we've seen a meaningful shift in how the U.S. is approaching critical minerals. The debate is no longer whether government should intervene, but how and with which tools. Last week saw the rollout of Project Vault, an ex-Im-backed facility designed to help U.S. manufacturers finance and store critical minerals. We've also seen Congress move supply-side legislation forward with the House passage of the Critical Minerals Dominance Act, aimed squarely at accelerating domestic mining, permitting, and project execution. Taken together, these actions signal something important. The U.S. is assembling a toolkit, not a single silver bullet. Trade finance, permitting reform, federal land execution, and allied supply chains. But there is still a missing layer: market stabilization. Long-cycle mineral supply chains continue to fail, not just because of permitting delays, but because extreme price volatility, often driven by foreign overcapacity and market manipulation, which destroys investments during downturns and affordability during upswings. That gap is where we're going to have a conversation today with Arnab Datta and Alex Turnbull of Employ America, a policy group that has been unusually focused on critical minerals as a market structure and financial infrastructure problem, not just a mining problem. Their work helped inform the Secure Minerals Act, which proposes the creation of a Strategic Resiliency Reserve, which would be a standing institution designed to stabilize critical minerals markets across cycles rather than react after the damage is already done. We're going to talk about how Secure and the proposed Strategic Resiliency Reserve are meant to complement, not compete with, efforts like Project Vault, Forge, and other supply-side legislation, which is introduced and talked about last week. We'll also spend a fair bit of time on lithium and why it remains the most practical first test case for a Strategic Resiliency Reserve, and how volatility on both the downside and the upside creates economic and national security risk. The goal today is to explain how the U.S. moves from ad hoc responses to a durable system that keeps critical supply chains investable, resilient, and competitive over time. Before we get started, I'd like to flag a note I published related to this on Monday entitled "Which Critical Minerals Matter Most?", which provides a framework for prioritizing among the 60 minerals designated as critical by the USGS and thinking about the most relevant tools to address these minerals. J.D. Vance last week at opening Rubio's ministerial said, "Critical minerals projects die on the vine because of extreme price volatility. Capital walks away and new supply never materializes." If volatility is the disease, what policy tools are the cure? And which of America's 60 critical minerals actually matter most, is what I covered in that paper. And a quick reminder, if you'd like to receive these blogs, as well as our monthly lithium-ion bowl directly to your email box, please visit rkequity.com and register your email. And if you find this content valuable, please remember to like, subscribe, and share Rockstock Channel videos. It really helps us grow this platform. And note, we may discuss individual stocks in this video, but we are not financial advisors and nothing in this video should be considered investment advice. Please do your own research and read the disclaimer at the end of this video. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, USCF Investments, who have been making it easier to access commodities investment strategies for almost 20 years. USCF's Sustainable Battery Metals Strategy Fund, ZSB, is designed to capture exposure to metals powering electrification, including lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, aluminum, and silver. To learn more, watch our episode with CEO John Love and visit uscfinvestments.com. and Lithium Royalty, which in December agreed to be acquired by Altius Minerals, a diversified royalty company based in St. John's, Canada. Altius seeks to create value through a diversified royalty portfolio. Lithium Royalty also holds a 1.5% gross revenue royalty on the Goulamina project in Africa, operated and owned by Ganfeng Lithium. And with that, welcome, Arnab, Alex. Could you please briefly explain who you are, what Employ America is, and what your focus is on, and how critical minerals became part of this work?
Sure. Howard, thanks so much for having us both on. So I'll just start. Employ America is a macroeconomic focused advocacy and research organization. Our North Star is full employment. So we really like tight labor markets with rising wages. And the work we do on critical minerals is part of our broader portfolio on commodity market stabilization. So we really started this work in the context of crude oil markets, given their importance to the macroeconomy, the fact that crude oil, oil prices and oil price volatility can have big inflation effects, but is also something that has with some frequency over the past several decades put us into a recession. And our critical minerals work was really an outgrowth of that. So we did a lot of work in 2021 and 2022 on modernizing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help manage help mitigate market volatility and insulate domestic shale producers from market volatility. And as an outgrowth of that, some folks in the Biden White House at the time had reached out and were interested in taking our approach to critical minerals, given their growing relevance to the energy sector, but more writ large as well to the defense sector. And so we really started to take an approach to that. And Alex is a frequent collaborator of ours, and I'll kick it over to him. But we got connected given his kind of work in the space.
Sure. I'm Alex Turnbull. I'm an Australian and based in Singapore. I have been an investor across the capital structure and metals and mining and materials and cyclicals for almost 20 years at this point. I was involved in the numerous restructurings and workouts and recapitalizations in critical minerals and metals and mining, including Talison, which was spun out of Sons of Gwalia bankruptcy, and Linus, the original financing for Galaxy, Lithium, and numerous others. So I followed this space for a long time, seen the issues and deep and pervasive issues with industrial strategy from China and its effects on supply security elsewhere. And so when I got in touch with Arnab, I thought it was a great opportunity to try to work out what could possibly work to change sort of a cycle of mostly unhappy outcomes from a policy point of view for Western governments for quite some time.
Okay, that's really great, Alex. Arnab, you and I met, I guess late December when we wrote this Strategic Lithium Reserve white paper, and you mentioned that 5 people, had kind of forwarded it to you. And so we started a dialogue then, and then you introduced me to Alex just last week in preparation for this interview. And I hadn't realized that Alex is really an original gangster in so many of the lithium endeavors that we were talking about. You were involved, I guess. So you looked at the Alita bankruptcy and Altura and other things back then. And a lot of, in this paper that I wrote last week, just in terms of prioritizing, the critical minerals, like which are most critical, it really is rare earths and, lithium and other battery materials. If you look at from a demand side, from a military aspect and, age of electricity. So great to have and understand, Alex. This is not just, and you're not a lobbyist, Arnab. You're more a macro focused,
Yes.
player. But I was very excited, to learn of Alex's stance as an investor and practitioner, and having experienced China influence on the rare earths and lithium market directly, and I wrote that paper in part because I saw the House hearings in October where Lithium Americas and MP were on a panel in front of the House. I think it was Molinar, who was one of the co-sponsors of this bill on the China Select Committee, was largely arguing, China was largely manipulating the prices of rare earths and lithium, and that is what J.D. Vance directly said is the problem. So with all of that as backdrop, a lot of tools and ideas were implemented last week. So Arnab, you've approached, and Employ America has approached critical minerals less as a geology and a permitting problem and more as a market and a volatility problem. What does that distinction mean in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question, Howard. And for one, I don't want to discount geology and permitting. I do a lot of work on permitting reform. I think it's absolutely crucial that we do permitting reform. But I think sometimes the market volatility problem is something that, I think people and policymakers really understand at a pretty high abstract level. I think it's one reason why price floors are such a dominant part of and stockpiling are such a dominant part of the conversation now. But there's less really examination of why the market functions or doesn't function, for lack of a better word, as it does. And I think we really tried to dig deep into why price volatility, like what are the mechanics that actually go into it? How are prices constructed in the market for these minerals? And I think in the context of China, you often hear it described as a function of overcapacity in China, and that China is really determining what the prices are, which is true. But I think it's important to step back and understand that this dominance in pricing was a fundamental priority of China's going back to, the 1990s. Obviously, they conducted a lot of industrial policy to build out their processing capacity. They had an international strategy to acquire assets. We know the stories of them kind of pushing prices down and then acquiring assets all across Africa and Latin America as distressed assets. But there's a third piece of that, which is that they dominate the market infrastructure. A lot of the benchmarks that have been developed in these rare earths and in lithium, those are, indexed to the Chinese market. And so we really tried to understand, why is the price so volatile and why does China exert this so much? And those three kind of work in concert to do so. And that really is a cap on investment. I think fundamentally our thesis here is that over time, because of the volatility, you see investors in the commodities sector tend to be less and less that investment tends to be less and less elastic with price rises. You see that producers hold back investment because even as prices are rising, because the super cycle dynamic, they can't predict when it'll go down again. That's out of their control largely. It can be a geopolitical event that turns it one way or another. And so you can't really count on that for investment. And so that's kind of where we came from it. We really focus on investment. And Alex, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would just say, just from a pure finance sort of point of view, you look at these critical minerals and even lithium, and the sort of peak to trough drawdowns of these metals are worse than crypto tokens in many cases. And that's not great, given that we do need these materials. Crypto tokens are, I guess, mostly optional. And they're also so much more volatile than products where you do have exchange, warehousing, inventories, hedging. Any of the LME metals are comparatively a lot more orderly. And so the question to my mind was, how much of this is just represents some sort of, inescapable physical reality, and how much of it is just a lack of development, a lack of, storage, financing, sort of the plumbing of of well functioning commodity markets. And my conclusion was, having seen these companies occasionally fail and get restructured and so forth up close was that illiquidity and that volatility was very much due to the market, not due to some deep, physical issue or chemical issue that you couldn't sort of use a bit of policy or financial engineering to improve.
Okay, great. I don't want to spend too much time on articulating the problem because a lot of the discussion this week and last kind of couple of weeks is we've known about this problem. We've been admiring this problem for a long time and haven't been doing much about it. But now the Trump administration is kind of moving at warp speed, and this is a bipartisan issue in the U.S. It's also multilateral, plurilateral. So there's a lot happening. So what changed, right, in the past couple of weeks? So is Project Vault, a solution? And how does that? Is this going to solve the problems that we're articulating? And where does secure and what you're doing legislatively come in? Help us understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great start. I think you're starting to see, and I would even go back a bit further. There were a number of kind of different initiatives taken under the Biden administration. I think a distinction that I would draw that the Trump administration has taken a pretty aggressive approach is, they are very much expanding the toolkit. You see the use of everything from a price floor to if you go back to the MP materials deal, for example, from August of last year, that single deal had a price floor, a guaranteed offtake agreement for finished magnets. It had an equity investment, a loan, a guaranteed EBITDA. So they're really just like expanding what is kind of possible and the way in which the government intervenes. Over the past few months and then leading up to Project Vault and then the Forge meeting last week, the ministerial meeting, you are seeing a real focus on developing liquid, diversified, better functioning markets. If you look at the agreements that President Trump signed with the prime ministers of Japan and Australia, one of the first clauses in those agreements is a commitment to support diversified liquid markets. And that was front and center to the Forge meeting last week. And I see Project Vault as, a great first step towards that as well. There's a lot of questions I have. There aren't a lot of details available yet about like how it's being structured and managed. But the fact that they're putting capital in, it's lent capital. So, this is different than, and it looks different on the government balance sheet than a lot of these other interventions. But they're loaning this to a private, an intermediary, in this case, basically like a special purpose vehicle. This is actually something that Alex and I had written about a couple of years ago as well and proposed as a way to potentially do this. And they're bringing in market actors to execute this. And I think that's incredibly valuable. The fact that Traxys, Hartree, and Mercuria are the ones who are going out to procure, that fact in and of itself is going to potentially bring in more liquidity to the market because they're also going to seek hedging for the trades that they make with this capital potentially. So I think there's a lot of potential, but I think we're going to need more resources. Like I don't think 12 billion is going to cut it, but it's a great start.
Do you have any view, Alex, on Project Vault? What it's designed to do, and what is it not designed to do?
Sure. As I understand it, it's meant to allow lending to intermediaries, so trading houses who already have storage, infrastructure, physical places to put this stuff, to go out and accumulate it with some effectively, margin loans or back lending from the government. And what that allows them to do is, in markets where you often just can't get bank lines in a lot of these materials because they're not exchange traded, or relatively liquid on exchange, so stuff like cobalt, you can then go out and take a position that the market's oversupplied today, but it'll be better in 12 months, and you can cross that. You can finance that stockpile building and sell it forward or what have you. You still need that sort of physical delivery futures layer to cross those, to box those trades. But once you have that and bank lines, I mean, these markets should behave a bit more like, your copper, zinc, aluminiums of this world, and, less like sort of hyper volatile, off the run metals.
That's like whatever's happening on GFEX.
Yeah, whatever. Well, yeah, I mean, and GFEX is interesting, but it's like delivery in China, which is not really relevant for secure supply outside China. So, we need exchanges with delivery terms that are not, in China, if we want, a point of reference for secure supply, which cannot be restricted by, Xi Jinping having it out of a dissatisfying breakfast or whatever.
Okay. Before last week's events, there were some more executive orders coming out of the White House from Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative, which were very focused on processing. And we've done a couple of videos. Really, it's processing. It's not mining. We've got to figure out the midstream on the processing. So does Project Vault or Forge, or what we heard from last week, actually incentivize processing? It's not clear to me how Project Vault, which is kind of like a stockpiling and a project financing vehicle, actually incentivizes processing. I mean, does it, or does Forge? What's your read?
It's a great question, Howard. It's something I'm hoping that we can get some more details on this. From what I've seen, and I think there has been some mixed reporting as well, but I know that the head of Exim did an interview last week at CSIS that I would encourage everyone to watch. But I don't think that this is going to be limited to just upstream materials. Obviously, the question with storage becomes volatility and whether you can store something, right? I could imagine kind of a midstream solution like carbonate potentially being part of this. Certainly not hydroxide in the context of lithium. But I would suspect that it's probably not going to be storing a lot of spodumene. But I think it remains to be seen. But from what I've heard and seen kind of in reporting, I think that processed materials could be part of this as well. Again, depending on how much, whether you can store them or not.
Yeah. I mean, the big problem with storing a lot of lithium products is they're very hydrophilic and they don't store very well. It's sort of more like coffee beans. Like you don't want to leave them out for more than, hydroxide, most people say about 2 years, you're going to have some issues. Carbonate's a bit longer, but, you are sort of bounded by the physical realities of these metals. Whereas, gallium, indium, whatever, you can put it in a vault and check back and it won't be any more tarnished than your gold.
Right. I think there was a note out of CSIS today, and it was also discussed in that interview that you mentioned, Arnab, that there'll be some rotation in there. But more to the point, when I think about processing, a lot of these are not commodities; they're specialty materials, and the OEMs, GM, Boeing, they have very high spec requirements, right? So it's one thing to kind of like stockpile copper concentrate, right? I don't know if that's what they're going to use it for, but so there were customers. This is meant to be civilian stockpile, not defense stockpile. It's financed by individual OEM customers who don't necessarily want to, tie up their balance sheet by owning all of stockpiling these materials themselves. So here, they give a shopping list. This is what we want. Mercuria kind of goes out and procures it. It sits, the Exim finances it for a period of time, but and then, I guess there's some timing, maybe they're buying low, but it's meant to be if there's a shock and it's unavailable, right? So when rare earths saber rattling happens. Ford doesn't say, shoot, I don't have magnets for my Ford Explorer, right? That's the similar to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which was meant to buy like 60 days time. I've heard Project Vault was meant to kind of like buy 60 days time, but I don't see how this long-term incentivizes a build out of an ex-China supply chain of more mine to magnet or mine to battery. So what you described earlier about MP, that was very specifically the government picked a company, gave price floors and loans and or contract for differences, however you want to call it. And it was time-based, I think 10 years. There was upside provisions in there for the government. It was very well structured, but it was very specific to a company. And your work on the Strategic Resiliency Reserve, and you had done a bunch of writing even before this, Secure Act came in. I mean, I believe, and again, the Strategic Lithium Reserve, which I articulated, was more a market-wide structure. It was government influence into a market to directly address the price volatility, which J.D. Vance rightly recognizes the core problem. And you discussed earlier, if prices are up, down every 2 years, then the private sector is not responsive, to 2-year volatility cycles when they're making 20-year investments. So I didn't see anything. Did you see anything so far in what was announced by the administration? Because Project Vault got a lot of attention. And Forge got a bit of attention, and Pax Silica got, some attention, but I still don't see these market stabilization tools being implemented. And that's why I think like the Secure Act, which you've had a lot of influence in getting behind, I'd like to talk about that and how that's different. And this is a legislative thing. So what is the problem this legislation is trying to solve, that the existing executive branch tools don't fully address is the question.
Yeah, I think it's worth, it's worth stepping back and just kind of one thing that the Secure Act, so it establishes a government corporation, the Strategic Resilience Reserve Corporation of the United States, which has a diverse toolkit. So all of these tools that you've seen the Trump administration deploy, it's got a toolkit for that. But the purpose of this corporation is not to stockpile. It's not to make equity investments. It's not to, engage in price floors. These are all tools towards an end of building a diverse, liquid, better functioning market ex-China. And so the tools are all deployed with that purpose. And so what that in practice looks like is that in addition to, having the flexibility where necessary to do an MP materials type deal, a lot of the language and the structure of this is oriented around incentivizing that market development by empowering intermediaries to trade more, exchanges to develop more contracts. So, like we've done, we've spoken with folks at, whether it's the more established exchanges like CME, but companies like Abex as well that are newer kind of in this space and really building it, really kind of getting into physical, so really centering their strategy around physical contracts. We're trying to make sure that those pieces of the market also get support, because ultimately that's how you get a sustainable commercial market. It's not going to be driven by government dollars. You need someone to bring liquidity to the market. I think, going back to a point I made earlier, an undertold story about how China built this dominance is coming out of the global financial crisis. You had metals that, in the West, a lot of banks and financial institutions closed their metal desks. And you just saw a huge, net negative of liquidity from the market. And so we're really trying to bring that liquidity back to the market ex-China. And part of that is providing leverage to intermediaries like, Atraxis or companies like these, but then also supporting exchanges to develop new contracts. There is momentum here, but you need someone to kind of put up the capital so that these companies can bring that liquidity. So that's kind of what this bill tries to solve, that these one-off kind of projects just can't solve because there isn't enough capital at the federal level. There isn't enough structural kind of institutional design and enough prioritization of that. They're bound by kind of the legal constraints and regulatory constraints that they're working within.
Okay. So the bill is it proposes a new government entity with an independent board. And what does that enable, that a traditional agency program would not?
Yeah, so a government corporation would just, there are flexibilities that government corporations have that traditional agencies wouldn't. Some of these are like very technical. I can give you kind of one interesting example that I think is very relevant to the private sector, but government corporations are not necessarily bound by the Administrative Procedures Act. And what that means, it's a commercial institution. It's not a government institution. And what that means is when you go to court, when there's a dispute, it's litigated as a commercial issue and not as a government commercial dispute. Traditionally, if an agency goes to court in one of these disputes, it's going to be held to a more deferential standard, which puts private businesses at quite a disadvantage. A government corporation looks very different that way. So that's like one, but there's a number of different ways that government corporations have flexibility. They're intended to operate as private businesses. And I think one point as well on just the independence that's important is that, from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration and now to the second Trump administration, I think a pattern across all of these is that there's too much disclaiming of the previous administration's policy efforts. And we're trying to avoid that. I think one thing that the private sector needs is continuity across administrations. And this is kind of an effort to do that. Stability is really important. I don't want to see an LNG pause any more than I want to see a frivolous stop work order on a solar farm or whatever it is. And I think that's the principle we're trying to take here, is that you want minimal kind of political interference. You want this to have some level of independence so that it can make these long-term decisions and actually help drive capital cycles in a stable and predictable way.
Okay. So this is a introduced legislation. It was bipartisan, meaning both Republicans and Democrats like it, and it was bicameral, right? The House and the Senate have introduced this. So what is the process from here to actually get this enacted? Because it's critically important, as you said, to have the executive and legislative branch. You can't just unwind it, when Trump leaves office, right? So this is would be a durable, a very durable, long cycle, but fundamentally, right? If this passes, you have a new entity here, right? That basically says it's not just a defense stockpile. There's a government actor in here that's intervening in certain markets that they determine to be important, right? And it seeks to directly address the price volatility. So there's a lot of similarities with this and with the Strategic Lithium Reserve that I was talking about, in that lithium and rare earths is not a fully private market. Like in the West, we just act, it's private market, right? Prices go up, prices go down, it just happens. But you have China, with their thumb on the scale, on the supply side. This would be like Uncle Sam and maybe allies with their counterbalancing thumb on the scale on the demand side. That's how I think about it. Is that a right way to think about it? And, and then if so, what happens from here? How do we get this enacted?
Yeah, you're absolutely thinking about it correctly. I think I'll get to the enactment. One thing I want to highlight about this too, because I think one skepticism that probably folks in your audience will have is great, a government agency, putting its thumb on the scale and picking, different companies or like not actually having any market expertise. We have built this institution to have market expertise. They've got special hiring authorities to bring in people from the private sector, finance, traders, et cetera. There's a division. I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's essentially like a division that is intended to just do market analysis and really fundamentally understand where the vulnerabilities are, how these markets are structured, and what the best touch points are, right? Because we've given it this diverse toolkit because, what looks the same, what's a useful intervention in the scandium market is going to look very different than the copper market, which is going to look very different than the lithium market. We want it to be able to do that. And so in that sense, it's modeled more similar to the Federal Reserve, which has, a very technocratic, capable staff, private sector level compensation. So that's one thing I just wanted to say there. In terms of enactment, so this is basically a couple of years ago, the House side established a special select committee on China, and it came up with a big list of recommendations to counter China. It's like a national security, economic security committee. They don't have authorizing authority, meaning like they can't authorize legislation themselves that then gets full House consideration. This reserve was a recommendation out of that. And Representative Rob Whitman of Virginia has really been the champion of this from the beginning. Like he's the one who took this on, has been the champion on the House side. He has introduced it, as I mentioned, you mentioned with colleagues, and there's a Senate companion bill with, Republicans and Democratic co-sponsors. So they've introduced it and it's been referred to the House Natural Resources Committee. They're now doing committee consideration of it. So they'll have a hearing in some time in the next couple of weeks where, the way that this works is first you go through the committee and then eventually you get full House consideration and maybe there's a vote. Then it goes Senate. The question is like bills rarely pass like this on their own. You need some kind of a vehicle to attach it to, a legislative vehicle, so like some kind of must pass legislation. In this case, there's a couple of potential must pass vehicles. One is the National Defense Authorization Act, which passes every year and authorizes a number of different defense programs. So the Development Finance Corporation, which your audience might be familiar with, that was established in 2018 through an NDAA. So that's one potential vehicle. Another is the Export-Import Bank is being reauthorized at the end of this year. So there would potentially need to be some design changes there, and it might change the committee of jurisdiction. And so we'd have to, go through that committee process again, potentially. But committee, we're hitting the first threshold, which is like serious committee consideration. That is like a major checkpoint. It makes this a lot more kind of serious. I mean, representatives and senators release bills all the time. They don't get to kind of this level of consideration. So that's our first threshold, but we're doing well on that part.
Okay. So next step is we might have some hearings similar to the hearings where John Evans and Matt Slauscher of MP and LAC, where I watched that, where under the China Select Committee, and they'll say, okay, we're now going to call in some experts to talk about the Secure Act and a Strategic Resiliency Reserve. And a lot of the same questions we're addressing here now.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll ask. And then once that happens, then you're saying legislation like this doesn't really just happen on its own. So this National Defense Authorization Act or the EXIM reauthorization, which are two acts that are, or two things that have to happen, this could get added to later this year. So this is something that is not going to happen this month, but it could happen in 9 to 12 months.
Yeah,
6 to 12 months.
That's low. It's always hard to pass big legislation, but we want to stay ambitious. And, this has been an effort we've been working on for 2-3 years now. So,
right. Well, I mean, there's huge tailwinds at your back, right? With the White House pushing for this and the critical minerals being so topical and this being complementary. I mean, this is not the same as the other things that have been implemented. And Okay, so when the House committee says, okay, this sounds like an interesting idea, and there are 60 critical minerals, not all commodities, critical minerals are the same. How should policymakers, think about which commodities belong in the Strategic Resiliency Reserve over time?
Alex, I'll kick it to you for that one.
Yeah, I mean, there's a USGS critical minerals list. I think there's obviously a number of them which are very appropriate for defense applications. Your samarium, sort of cobalt stuff, scandium, things that go into specialty metal alloys for aerospace and so forth. Those will obviously go in. I think the other sort of larger commodity markets, which are more commercial and stuff like batteries, lithium, obviously, nickel, also cobalt. Those would be more targeted by these kind of lending mechanisms and also developing better market infrastructure. So I think there'll be quite a few, which will, there'll be a long list, frankly. Some of them which will lend themselves to better market infrastructure because they're large enough markets. Some of them will be, more pure defense, or, trying to stabilize output for particular rare earths, for example.
I would also add to that, that as I mentioned, there's a few government lists. There's USGS, there's defense lists, there's the Department of Energy list. The approach that we've taken with incorporating those lists is that there needs to be a prioritization function at the corporation. And so that's kind of what this division of risk assessment I mentioned will be conducting. But then I also think there's a good question of where should you test this out? And I think, Alex and I, when we started writing about this, we wrote a piece about all critical minerals. I think the first big thing we collaborated on, but then we did a series in 2023, I think it was, on lithium specifically, because, and Howard, I think one thing, a number of things, I found a lot of synergy between your strategic lithium reserve proposal and our strategic resilience reserve proposal was a focus on lithium because it is a good target market, but then also the fact that we're trying to take this commercial market approach.
Okay, so lithium, Alex mentioned, you just mentioned it, battery materials. Again, I wrote this paper this week to how do you prioritize, and I took if you look at the Project Vault initial customers, right? And I looked at the U.S. National Defense Strategy, which just came out in January, and it talked about the modernization of our military. And, I asked a large language model, okay, look at those customers and look at, the defense. What are they buying and what raw materials, do you estimate, could go into those? And it came out with very significantly, the magnet materials, the rare earths to magnets, right? And lithium battery materials. So not just lithium and but nickel sulfate, cobalt sulfate, graphite anodes, PCAM, et cetera, are the whole supply chain is necessary. It's not just these raw materials. But you said even as far back as 2023, I hadn't even realized this, Arnab, that you had focused on lithium. I guess lithium has been super volatile. Alex, you've made a bunch of investments along the volatility ride within lithium. So how is a strategic resiliency reserve, capitalized, right? How much money is necessary and how do you see it intervening, and what happens when, how you said it'll be like the Fed, right? The Fed, when the Fed intervenes sometimes if the yen is overvalued or undervalued relative to the dollar, it intervenes. Is that how you see the resiliency reserve working? So if lithium's at 9,000, they come in and buy, but if lithium's at 40,000. They're selling. Like, how does that work?
Go ahead, Alex.
There's, first of all, that they'd have the analytic capacity within this agency, this corporation, to ask, speaking of lithium, questions like, okay, China's decided to turn on every lepidolite mine all at once, and they've got, some guy at the Fast Markets conference banging his shoe on the table, Khrushchev style, saying, I'm going to crush this market. You laugh, but there wasn't the shoe, but the message was the same, right?
I think that was post-IRA, right, Alex?
That was post-IRA, and I was there, and this guy gave this talk, and then he was even more forthcoming in Chinese later. And I spoke with a friend at a trading house. I was like, man, this is going to get really ugly. He was like, oh, like how ugly? I'm like, really ugly. They're about to throw down. And then you could, for example, this agency say, okay, like what is the actual break even of these lepidolite mines? And if they start jamming it down south of there, you say, all right, that's enough of that. We're going to start leaning the other way and, have a tender out to lend to people to accumulate, spodumene or what have you, to ensure this, intermittent, this temporary glut gets soaked up. And then you probably have the State Department go and say, look, guys, we see what you're doing and we're leaning on the other side of the seesaw. And, why don't we both step off? That would be the way you do it. That's a very practical example. I think getting rid of that kind of aggressive, strategic behavior, and this kind of trying to run capacity off the road just as it starts to come online, and having a mechanism to stop that strategy working would mean that maybe you could let markets do their thing in a slightly more natural fashion. Because I worry that if you don't have this entity, ex-China supply and supply chains are effectively bringing a knife to the gunfight. And that historically has not gone super well so long as I've been in this space.
I think just to pick up on that too, this is not intended to manage the market, to like be the one deciding what's right in the market. It's really about insulating our market and like developing a market more insulated from, a non-market actor in this space. I mean, Alex mentions the lepidolite mines all being turned on. I think this summer they didn't renew any of their permits, and they turned them basically all off.
Yeah, which is a cue to get massively long.
And then now we're in a new bull cycle, basically, right? And so I think it's really about making sure that we're insulated from these types of dynamics. And so that's kind of a big piece of what we're trying to do here with this.
Okay. A few final questions, all like related to this. I remember Paul Graves, the former CEO of Arcadium, in one of his quarterly calls after Biden passed the IRA, kind of indicated like you had this big approach by the U.S. And he said, like, if you do this, you can't expect, China just to sit back and not react, right? So China reacted, as you just described, Alex, to policies which were meant to kind of like thwart their behavior. So we are now enacting new policies. I don't know what we've seen yet out of China in relation to these policies, but what do you think like might come next from China in this regard? And before answering that, just think about it in the context. Trump's going to meet Xi in April. We've been proponents of, this is a big trade negotiation, right? He wanted to get all the smaller countries done, but this is a G2 world. And even Howard Lutnick mentioned this at CSIS. He said that, they got us, our Achilles heel might be, the magnet supply chain, but we have ethylene and they need ethylene, right? Like, so that these are mutually assured annoyance is what he said. It's not mutually assured destruction. So these are trade related issues, but a lot of the context of the China-U.S. debate has been like, we're fighting China. We messed up. We were asleep at the switch, but we're completely interconnected with them. I mean, Albemarle just announced today that, they're shutting down Kemerton in Australia, and they're going to process it in other ways, which means they're going to process it in China. So it's a very, counter balancing, impact. We're trying to get ex-China processing, and here the biggest lithium company in the world is shutting down, its only remaining, processing facility, other than the ones in North Carolina. So I guess the question is, like, I don't know. How do you see this playing out from a China-U.S. perspective? We are vulnerable in critical minerals. We're addressing these things, but we're not in a real war, right? This is their trade dynamics. So, like, we have our problems. China has their problems. Isn't there scope here to kind of like maybe ratchet down the pressure a bit and just kind of figure out, look, Canada's opening up to China, right? So, like, how does it play out, right? Over the year.
I mean, I'll kick it over to the Mandarin speaker shortly, but I think one thing is, as you mentioned, there are areas where they are dependent. There's areas where we're dependent. I mean, you saw the rare earth blow up a couple of months back. That happened in the context of AI chip exports as well, the Hopper chips, the H200s. And so we can't kind of separate, like, we have this vulnerability. They have other vulnerabilities. And I think absent, a war, we're likely to see this kind of, negotiation and pressure ratchet up and then dampen down. I think in the context of what this policy is and what we're seeing from the Trump administration and what the Secure Act is trying to do is, it's really trying to limit, like, it's trying to maybe get back some escalation dominance, right? In any kind of conflict like this, the party that is most likely to fold is the one with the most to lose and the least independence. And so we're really trying to build our power back in that context. And I think that's kind of where you will see, you also see China taking those steps by investing in more advanced chip design and manufacturing. Whether they'll be able to is another question. Now you're seeing, discussion of more restrictions on, machine tooling for those AI chips. I think that, this is something where you're just going to see it kind of play out over time. My key question that we've been obsessed with here is, like, how do you reduce our dependence there? But Alex, I don't know if you have thoughts you want to add.
Yeah, I think it's, I used to be a judo and jiu-jitsu gym rat, and I think it's going to be an endless cycle of people trying to grab each other's sleeves and collars, and that's just going to be how it goes. But you don't want to give them a move that works the same time every time and lands you on your ass. Sorry for the language. So you don't want to have them have 90+% share in anything, which is terribly important, which you don't have substitutes for. So rare earths. And so for lithium, for example, maybe Kemerton is not required because the US could secure in a pinch its supply of carbonate or intermediate products like lithium chloride from Argentina or Chile, or from maybe there's going to be a hard rock processing plant in Canada at some point. But the point is, you just want to ensure that you're not going to get flipped on these supply chains when they want to throw down. And you can spend a lot of money to build up capacity in country for everything. That's kind of the North Korean Juche model. Or you can work with allies, kind of ensure you have a nice diversified portfolio and a mechanism to manage overall dumping behavior quickly and in a timely fashion with an SRR. And then you can probably get to the point where they're not going to do this anymore because it won't work anymore. And I think that's the ideal state of the world, where they determine that this isn't going to work, so we're going to knock it off.
Right. Okay. To be seen, I guess, in April when Trump and Xi meet. We'll see how this evolves. The tone, out of Besant seems to be less aggressive toward China than it was, this time last year. But we'll see. I guess another market question is if the market in a lot of these materials is oversupplied, and we're talking about adding supply, ex-China. So where's the demand, function, right? Did some argue the Biden administration, people said like 30D for the electric vehicles. Like if you've gotten, like, you need incentive for electric vehicles for batteries so that you could incentivize that supply chain. So now if we've killed the demand side to some degree on the EV side, how do you build an ex-China supply chain in a world of oversupply?
It's a great question, Art. I mean, I think the loss of, I wish I had a better answer. Part of what we're trying to do here is encourage more demand that, intermediaries serve some, at least, of that demand, in the, in between. But you're right. You need some level of commercial demand that is, happening at the end there. And the loss of 30D is huge. I think there's a lot of focus on the on the defense industrial base. But in reality, like, your defense industrial base is only as resilient as your commercial industrial bases, because, in a war scenario, in kind of the worst tail risk scenarios, you're not just like running through your stockpile and like, that's it, everything's over. You need some capacity that can then be turned towards defense efforts. And if we don't have that kind of native commercial capacity, it's much more difficult in that defense scenario. And so I think the loss of 30D is big. I mean, AI, energy demand, certainly that will be a big part of it. You're seeing increasing use of batteries, and other technologies. Graphite is really important for nuclear facilities and small modular reactor designs. So, like, I think that there are other sources of demand, but the loss of 30D is big.
Yeah, I'd say, look, losing that demand is not helpful. The way to get really cheap drones is to have lots of other demand for batteries and electric motors and sensors and so forth, which means that, your incremental cost of making a drone is very low because you've already got that underlying capacity. The good news is there's plenty of other countries that don't want to be coerced by China either, particularly in Europe. There's been some countries which have been on the receiving end of some pretty robust, unpleasant treatment there over the last couple of years. And this is the thing, having a more of a portfolio approach where you can, it's cheaper to buy the lithium insurance in Australia or Argentina or Chile. But if you want to open a really big low cost copper mine, you go to Arizona currently. So the trick is to get that portfolio of insurance at the best price you can with allies, and then have an overall mechanism, an SRR, to enable you to step into these markets directly in physical, as opposed to, getting hit by some rare earth controls and then running around trying to do all these individual deals in a rush. I mean, you ideally want to have something which can just be constantly in the background so that if the proverbial hits the fan, you can immediately start to respond. And you don't have to kind of go into a panic and try to, do several years of resources investment banking in 8 months.
Right. Okay. We're not going to solve all of this here in this conversation, but I really appreciate both of you coming on. A key objective of this was just to further educate our viewers, but also continue to socialize the Secure Minerals Act as an idea. And if any of our viewers want to help get behind that effort, I've obviously been championing the Strategic Lithium Reserve, within this, and Arnab's based in Washington, and will be supporting him, as this goes through House committee, et cetera. But if people wanted to follow you, Arnab and Alex, how or get involved, how could they reach you?
You can find me on Twitter at Arnab Datta 321. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at arnab@employamerica.org.
I think you've written a Substack or two as well. There was a piece I saw last week on equity stakes, which could be a source for the future discussion.
Yeah, for sure. I split my time at another organization called IFP. We have a Substack called Factory Settings that is about the implementation of the CHIPS Act. So a great place to subscribe, and you can find me on there too. And Howard, also, thanks for having us, and thank you for all your work that you've done in this space. And I think we connected because we have a lot of overlap in what we've done here. So really appreciate everything you've done.
Pleasure. It's really just beginning. Things don't move so quick, but they're moving quickly. And Alex, anyone to reach out, or you're a hedge fund guy and you want to hide?
Yeah, on Bloomberg and on LinkedIn. Less not really on Twitter as much these days. It's got a bit crazy over that place. But yeah, you can find me pretty readily. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks to you both, and look forward to following up, and maybe we'll do this again in 6 months or so.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
With champagne, hopefully.